We begin this morning with Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. Congressman Fitzpatrick is a member of the Bipartisan Congressional Climate Solutions Caucus and recently introduced a first-of-its-kind legislation in the House of Representatives to simultaneously combat carbon emissions and fund infrastructure modernization. Joining the Congressman on stage is my colleague and friend, The Hill's Editor-in-Chief, Bob Cusack. Gentlemen.
Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
Let me start off with the softball. Do you know who wrote the op-ed?
If you find out, let me know.
Okay. We live in very polarizing times. Climate change is an issue that's been around a long time. Different administrations have had different approaches to it. There's been bipartisanship on it. But do you think that the parties can come together on an issue that has been polarizing?
They have to. I mean, it's not a question of can. The parties have to come together. We live in a centrist country, and one of the reasons why on this issue, when I got to Congress, I'm in my first term, came in from the FBI, and on the issue of climate, on the issue of the environment, the first person I sought out was Carlos Corbello of Florida, because when you look to these issues, when it comes to labor, you try to seek a mentor in each of these areas that you can sort of pick their brain. And it was a combination of the manifestation of my relationship with Carlos, as well as my engagement in the Problem Solvers Caucus to kind of advance a lot of bipartisan solutions, and this being one of them. So it started with HR 195, which was the declaration that this is a significant problem from a humanitarian standpoint, a health standpoint, a national security standpoint, and then ultimately culminating in the Market Choice Act, which Carlos and I introduced. And there's been a lot going on in between, but the combination of the Climate Solutions Caucus coupled with the broader view and perspective of the problem solvers.
You mentioned the Corbello legislation. Can you describe what that would do and how you build support for that?
Yeah, I mean, we got, to your earlier question, we need bipartisan solutions on this issue. That's the only way we're going to get something actually done rather than a lot of talk. And this is something that brought the environmental community, the business community, the labor community all together on the need to fund transportation and infrastructure. That's been a big gap right now that we have not been able to accomplish, mainly because the funds are not there. So why not tax something like carbon, which we know to be harmful? We can achieve our commitment under Paris, 30% reduction by 2025, 40% by 2030, by taxing at a rate of about $24 per metric ton of carbon in order to raise the money and also simultaneously fight climate change. So it's that sort of bipartisan approach where you bring everybody to the table. That's the only way we're going to get things done. These purely partisan solutions are never going to work because they're never going to get the votes they need to pass. We're trying to get something across the finish line to advance the ball.
Do you think that solutions could be had in this administration? By Vox's count, President Trump has had 115 tweets doubting climate change. So is this a long-term solution, or could something actually be done in the Trump administration?
Well, we need short-term and long-term solutions for sure. I don't think those tweets are helpful. I think that goes without saying. Carlos and I stand for something very different. We're trying to be that voice inside the GOP caucus to advance common sense, bipartisan solutions to what he and I believe is a very, very significant threat. And we need that to be a bipartisan concern. Everybody always asks where these values come from. I can answer for myself. When I was a Boy Scout, I ultimately became an Eagle Scout, but the essential motto in the Boy Scouts when you went camping was leave no trace. And I will always remember the Scoutmasters being so detailed that even if there were twigs or sticks out of the way that were cleared off to get a ground level, you had to replace them. And that's a value, that you have to leave no trace when you camp. We should leave no trace as human beings here on the planet.
And what happens if nothing is done?
A big problem. It's a health crisis from a clean air perspective, from a natural disaster perspective. You heard talk about the wildfires, the droughts, the flooding. Carlos is worried about a portion of his district disappearing if we don't act, with the rising sea levels, with the contamination of the fresh water supplies, particularly in the Everglades, which are imminently at risk. and the natural disasters. I was in Puerto Rico over Thanksgiving, dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane, and it's devastating. And some people can argue it's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that we're seeing an increased prevalence in natural disasters. We're seeing rising sea levels, increased temperatures on the planet. These are facts, and that's what we need to get back to, is facts and science rather than propaganda.
What do your constituents say about this issue? I mean, if you look at polls, it's not a top issue right now anyway.
Even if it's not a top issue in polls, true leaders lead the polls. They don't follow them. We need to make this a big issue, and we need to be talking about it. People talk about the things that they see and hear every day. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. It's our job to bring this issue to the attention of voters. We're dealing with a really significant environmental issue in our district, specifically dealing with water contamination, with the PFCs, the PFAS, PFOA, that was contained in firefighting foams that's really wreaked havoc on the water supply throughout our district. Now, it only affects certain parts of the district, but it's our job to bring those issues to the attention of the broader constituency, and that also applies to climate change and to everything else.
What is the role of the business community and other stakeholders to push lawmakers, administration officials on climate change?
They have a duty, as we all have a duty as human beings. Labor has a responsibility, business has a responsibility, the environmental community has a responsibility, all to advance. And I reject, and I said this on day one, reject this notion that growing the economy and preserving our climate and our environment are mutually exclusive concepts. They are not. In fact, I believe that they support one another. I think businesses that prove to be good environmental stewards, they have less protests, they have less boycotts on their products, they have fewer lawsuits, and they're doing the right thing by the climate and by the country. So I think it's good for the environment, and it's good business practice as well.
You're a member of the Climate Solutions Caucus. There are about like 10 million caucuses in Congress. But what does your caucus do? Who's in it? And how often do you meet?
Ted Deutsch and Carlos are the co-chairs. And interestingly, it's sort of a lot of the members of the Climate Solutions Caucus are also members of the problem solvers. So the problem solvers are actually the ones really leading the charge on a whole host of areas, this one included. So we're dealing with immigration, we're dealing with transportation, we're dealing with prison reform, we're dealing with health care. And this was sort of the transportation piece of that / environmental piece. So the Climate Solutions Caucus doesn't meet as frequently as the problem solvers do by far. We meet literally every week. We're here in session, and this has sort of been consumed in, I would say.
What do you think? I mean, just generally politics. We've seen two Democratic incumbents, Joe Crowley, Mike Capuano, lose. We've seen Mark Sanford lose his primary. The politics of the moment is that the left is very strong and the right is very strong, and compromise, at least to those extremes, is a bad word. Do you see that after this election, I mean, we're already writing about 2020, but that there's hope for bipartisanship after this election, or do you want to wait till after 2020 or after 2024?
The one thing that I find very encouraging, because I share your view there. I mean, I think that it's just a reality of politics, unfortunately, that all the money and all the energy is usually at the extremes. I was telling the folks in the back room there, I never had a protester outside of my office holding up a sign saying, "I want more compromise." They don't exist, right? But the one thing that I am very hopeful for is the Problem Solvers Caucus has expanded its ranks significantly. We're now at 48 members, equally divided. It's a Noah's Ark rule. If you want to join, you have to find someone from the other party to join with you. We're now at 48 members. We've instituted a rule for the first time ever. Again, I'm a freshman, but this is the first time that the caucus has done this, that if 75% of the caucus members agree to a principle and 50% of each party's members agree to a principle, that we agree to vote as a block to get to a yes. And we did it most recently on the Break the Gridlock, which is really important because we crafted a lot of really, really good bipartisan solutions on immigration, on healthcare, on prison reform, where we get, people of all stripes come into that room. And, Jimmy Panetta led the charge on immigration. Josh Gottheimer led the charge on prison reform. Stephanie Murphy's had a huge role in this. It's just the concept that people that think differently than you, we should be seeking as representatives to extract their viewpoints. And it's very similar to the model we followed in the FBI. Anytime we had a time-sensitive crime problem, our solution was to surround the table with people from completely different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, coming from different parts of the country, different regions of the world. And what we would find is that based on everybody's upbringing and their perspective that they've grown up with, they approach a problem from a certain vantage point, but they learn from everybody else's paradigms, and ultimately that will lead us to getting one step ahead of that criminal. The Problem Solvers Caucus is essentially that in Congress. And the more we can grow, we're at 48 members now. I think if we can get to about 60, we can essentially become the new governing majority in Congress. We can actually get these bills to the floor. And that's been the challenge. We've developed great bipartisan solutions to really hot-button issues. These aren't just non-controversial issues. These are the most controversial subjects you can take on. Gun violence was another one that we developed a package for. We can't get them to the floor. So if we can get this Break the Gridlock package passed, that will allow these bills to get to the floor. And we can actually get a vote on it, because that's all we should ask for. Get these bills on the floor. Everybody should vote yay or nay, go back home and answer to their constituents for their vote.
Can you describe, we've been writing about it, and I think it's kind of an underrated story right now, what the problem solvers are doing, because that, as you mentioned, bringing bills to the floor, I mean, the House, whether it's run by Democrats or Republicans, it's basically a dictatorship. And what you guys are doing with the Speaker Project, why don't you describe that? Because that has a chance, certainly if the margin in the House in the new Congress next year is small, that there is a chance that the House could be run quite differently.
And this is why I think there is great hope for the problem solvers, because I think regardless of what happens in November, I think everybody's in agreement that it's going to be a slight majority, a very slight majority one way or another, which is going to increase the prevalence and the significance of the problem solvers exponentially. Because when you have now 48 members, and hopefully that grows and doesn't shrink in November, that's a big block of votes now in a tight margin.
And those are just 48 lawmakers. They're not candidates,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Correct.
So candidates, it could
Correct.
even grow.
Yes, and we have a lot of great candidates out there on both sides that are problem solvers that we're supporting. And that's really going to be the key. And, you know, a lot of us tweeted out, I certainly did, that's going to be determinative on who we vote for Speaker. Are they going to support these rules packages, things that abandon things like the Hastert rule, abandon things like motion to vacate the chair, allow every single one of the 435 members of Congress the ability to get a bill to the floor of the House of Representatives? That should be common sense, but it's not the case now. Every single one of us have a district priority, at least one, that we should be allowed to get to the floor of the House of Representatives.
And the motion to vacate the chair, certainly Paul Ryan is a fan of that, but of course he's retiring. But so there are some things in the rules package that leadership, whoever leadership is, and I've never seen a situation where I don't know who the next speaker is going to be. Usually it's the minority leader is definitely going to be speaker. We really don't know. We may not know until the actual public vote. But are you confident that as a group you're going to stand tough and say, listen, you accept these rule changes or we're not voting for you?
That's what we're about to find out.
Okay.
Who's going to stand up?
But you will?
Yes, I will.
Okay. Interesting. We're going to open it up for questions. If you've got a question, I think we've got mics around the room, and if you can identify yourself and then keep it relatively short because we can get several questions. Anyone out there? Okay, there's one up front.
Hi, Anna Unruh-Cohen with the Natural Resources Defense Council. In Congressman Fitzpatrick, I think it was notable that in the bill that you and Representative Corbello introduced on climate solutions, that you took proceeds from your fee and invested it in infrastructure and other things. In contrast to what a lot of sort of Republican think pieces have been suggesting for legislation recently, that money should be returned directly to people or used in other tax shifting mechanisms. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your decisions there to reinvest those proceeds.
Yeah, because we wanted to simultaneously advance two goals. We clearly have a dilapidated and antiquated infrastructure in this country, not just roads and schools and bridges, things we call covert infrastructure, but I'm sorry, overt infrastructure, but the more covert infrastructure, subterraneous water piping, the electrical grid, the IT infrastructure, the things that you don't see every day, but are critically important to the functioning of our economy, the function of our government, critical to national security. The electrical grid, I mean, when I was, my last FBI assignment, I was in Ukraine. The Russians, on 2 or 3 attempts, or 2 or 3 occasions, tried to cripple Ukraine's electrical grid as part of a cyber attack. I mean, these are critically important things that we need to address. So that's why Carlos and I said we're going to try to achieve simultaneous goals of preserving our environment, limiting carbon emissions, which is a goal that he and I share, and also simultaneously funding infrastructure. And 70% or so of the proceeds would go to the Highway Trust Fund. Another piece would go to states to help people at lower income levels pay their utility bills. So there's a lot of different pieces to it. I mean, obviously, we always want to try to improve it, but it was I thought, a very, very good first step and a good statement that we need to start moving in that direction.
How would you grade that Trump's EPA, obviously Scott Pruitt no longer there, but very controversial reign? How would you grade how the EPA has done under Trump?
I called for Scott Pruitt's resignation, so I should tell you right there.
Not a big fan. If you have any other questions, another one up front.
So my name is Charlie Panfil. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of Intelligent Democracy, which is a political action committee focusing on bipartisan solutions. And when we've evaluated Republican candidates, we've seen a real disconnect on climate change policy and other science-related policy, not necessarily in your case, Congressman Fitzpatrick. But how do you think that the Republican Party can make inroads with its constituency to kind of accept climate change as a more prevalent issue?
Yeah, there's always, and the problem solvers talk about this a lot, how take your issue, and there's disconnects that occur on both sides. I would say on our side, certainly the climate, and I think the answer to the question is having representatives that accept science and accept facts and base decisions on those things. That's step number one, is acknowledge reality and don't deny it. And second is getting out there in the community and talking about it. To Bob's point, it's not an issue that always necessarily polls really high in relation to everything else, but it's our job to go out there and talk about these things. If we recognize it as a problem, I certainly do, that we go out and we bring the topic up, even if it's not discussed. And that's why I was very, very excited to be here today when I was invited to talk about these things in a national forum. I want the message to be sent that this needs to be a bipartisan initiative. It has to be. And that starts with basing decisions on facts and science.
What do you think of the proposal that Democrats pushed years ago when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, before health care moved? The House passed a climate change bill. It got single-digit Republican support, but mostly kind of rammed through Democratic support and never got a vote in the Senate. Do you think that is part of that is the solution to that legislation?
Yeah, well, I was an FBI agent at the time, so I didn't read that bill. Right. What I believe to be the solution is the one that Carlos and I pushed and are pushing. I'm not a fan of single-party solutions to any issue, because that tells you something right off the bat. If it's a single-party solution, why is that the case? And again, you're going to hear me talk about problem solvers a lot. One of the core tenets of our caucus is that no one party has a monopoly on good ideas, and that everybody has something to contribute to the solution based on their unique paradigm and perspective that comes from their unique upbringing, regardless whether it's where they grew up or how they grew up or what they studied or where they worked. So just like any other relationship in life, you don't get everything you want 100% of the time, nor should you. I think that should follow in legislation as well.
And do you think the constituency, I mean, you think back to the 1990s, the Balanced Budget Act passed with President Clinton, Republican Congress, but more recently, sweeping legislation, it used to be, it had to be bipartisan, but whether it's the Affordable Care Act or the tax cuts, it's rammed through by one party. So do you think that there's going to be an appetite to go back to the way things kind of used to be?
I sure hope so. And again, that's why our caucus is so important, because we talk about it all the time. Here I am in an environmental forum talking about problem solvers. It is the only thing that's going to save our country. I really believe that. We have to get away from this Hatfield and McCoy brand of politics. I think it's tearing our country apart. I think civility feeds into that as well. And I tell every single person I meet that if you ever had a chance to sit in on one of our meetings, sometimes we meet really early in the morning, sometimes really late at night, you would be so proud of our country, because you have people that you literally cannot tell if they're a Democrat or Republican. People go in there, they focus like a laser on the problem, and they actively seek feedback from people that think differently than them. And you can apply that to any aspect in life. There are some people that go through life just wanting to surround themselves with people that think like them, and they want to validate their current beliefs. There's other people that want to step outside of their comfort zone. They want to be cross-examined. They want their paradigms challenged. And those are the people that learn and grow and ultimately are better leaders. And that's what our caucus is about.
Do you get frustrated with those in your party who doubt the science of climate change?
Of course I do. Of course.
Do you try to debate them?
I try to educate them.
Have you changed any minds yet?
I'm getting there on a few.
Okay.
I will tell you the members of our freshman class are the most easy to persuade. You know, we have a lot of really, really good members on both sides of the aisle in our freshman class, and you know, I think we need more younger people in Congress too. I think that helps because Republicans like myself obviously and Carlos take a different approach to the environment, and I think we need more of that in the caucus.
Well, we've run out of time. Please thank the congressman for joining us this morning. Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.